Welcome, everyone, to DENR's webinar on our new construction general permit. I'm going to give people another minute or two to kind of get settled in, and then we're going to start off with a roll call. I want to see which sites are there and are working. So I'll check in with you again in about another minute. Okay, welcome again. I'm Kelly Busher with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and I'm here to present some information on our proposals to change our construction general permit. What I'd like to do is just start off with a few logistics for our meeting today. First of all, we've got about a little over a dozen sites that we're going to be checking in with. So first thing I want to do is I'm going to do a roll call for each of those sites, make sure we've got everybody up and working. I guess the format that I would like to follow today is we're going to go through a presentation and get all the information out that we want to share today. So if people are happy with that and no questions, that'll give them a chance to leave. But then we're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentation. Since this is a kind of webinar format, a distance format, what we'll do with questions is we'll rotate around to each of the sites and give people the opportunity to ask one or two questions, move to the next site, and we'll just keep going around until we get through all the sites, if that makes sense to everyone. When your site is not talking, I would ask that you mute it, just to kind of keep things going a little bit smoother for everyone else on the line today. And then last, we should have a sign-in sheet at each of the sites. If you haven't yet, please sign in. We'd like to have your contact information so we can follow up if there's further questions. If we have questions on the information you presented to us today, anything like that, we want to be able to follow up with the folks that were on the call today. So with that, let's start with the check-in with everyone. I'm just going to go alphabetically. So first of all, Aberdeen, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Great. How many people do you have in Aberdeen now?
Just me.
Okay. Belle Fourche.
There's no participants today, so I'll have them disconnect the site.
Okay, I'll tell you what, if you wouldn't mind, maybe leave it up for about 15 minutes or so in case anybody shows up, but then that'd be fine if no one shows up to disconnect.
Okay, we'll do these.
Great, thank you. Brookings. Is anyone here from Brookings? Okay, I'll come back to Brookings. Custer.
Custer is here. We don't have any participants either.
Okay. Huron. Is anyone there from Huron? Okay, I'll come back. Mitchell.
I'm here.
Hey, Lucy, anybody there with you?
Nope.
All right, this is great. Pierre is here. We have got 4 participants plus 2 DNR staff here in Pierre. Rapid City.
Rapid City here in force.
Excellent. Hey, Randy? One other
Yes,
person there with you?
One other.
All right.
What's that?
I just said the same thing. One with you, right?
I have one, but he's a good one.
Oh, good. Welcome. Sioux Falls.
We're here, Kelly. Hello?
Hello? Oh, I got a blue screen here.
Oh, well, we're here and we can see you.
Okay, good. That's for the moment. That's the most important part. Well,
Probably have the display weird. We have 2 people plus me.
okay, great. Spearfish.
Hey, Kelly, it's myself and 2 other people, so I guess we rule West River.
All right, excellent. Watertown.
Watertown's here, myself and 1 other person.
All right. And Yankton. Do we have Yankton on? We are having technical difficulties with Yankton. So I'm not sure we're going to be able to get them on board. Actually, let me just check and see if I have a message from them. Okay. So we may not have Yankton on board. We'll get, nope, yeah, no luck with Yankton. So, all right. Let's check back in Brookings. Karen? Okay. Great. I really appreciate everybody coming here. I hope this is a good sign that we're not doing anything too crazy or controversial, but we do want to spend a little bit of time going through the permit. And this is going to be a good opportunity for us to present some information both on what the permit currently requires, as well as we're going to be talking about any changes that we're proposing. So with that, we'll go ahead and go to the presentation. Lorraine, if I can have you go to the presentation. Okay. As I said, we're here to talk about the construction general permit. Okay, there we go. Just a little bit of an overview on what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to give some brief background information just on what our program is, why we do the stormwater permitting. We're going to spend the majority of our time talking about the new construction permit. We'll also talk about the process for public involvement in this permit. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the inspection requirements, both on you as a permittee as well as what DE&R expects when we do an inspection. Some of the next steps going forward with getting this permit processed and in place. And then I also want to visit a little bit about some potential fees that we're looking at inputting. Now, the one thing I want to say, I know we've already gotten some feedback from people on the permit. We've had it online for a couple of weeks now. I want to let you know we're reviewing all of those changes. We haven't made any changes yet. We're going to be presenting off of what we put on the website, so everybody is seeing the same thing. That doesn't mean we haven't considered the changes that have been proposed or that we won't make them going forward, but I want to kind of keep the kind of a consistent message for the moment. We'll be talking about the permit that was online. So, with that, anytime I do a presentation and talk about our permitting program, I start with once upon a time in 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act. This is the rule that kind of governs everything that we do in my program. The goal of the act was to protect and improve water quality in the United States, and it authorized both states and EPA to issue permits for the discharge of pollutants into waters of the state from point sources. With the 1972 Act and the permits that followed, we saw some real improvements in water quality across the United States. The focus was on municipal wastewater treatment facilities. We eliminated raw sewage discharges, and then also industrial applications. What we found going forward is that this did not solve all the problems. We were seeing improvements, but it was not addressing some big problems that continued. I put up a slide here that shows typical erosion rates for land-based activities. This is something that EPA had put together. And what they found is that bare soil from an unmanaged construction site can contribute large amounts of sediment into water bodies, which can contribute to pollution, impact aquatic life, that kind of thing. So with that in mind, Congress expanded the Clean Water Act in 1987 to include stormwater runoff. Specifically from construction sites, although some others were rolled into that as well. We're going to focus on the construction activities today. With those changes, it required a permit for the runoff from construction sites. Initially, it was 5 acres. They phased that in and then dropped it down to 1 acre, and that's where we're sitting today. So with all of that, any construction sites that are disturbing over 1 acre of soil need to have a permit as required by the Clean Water Act. One of the provisions of the Act also is that states could take over this program. So in 1993, South Dakota obtained delegation. We obtained the authority from EPA to implement this program ourselves. We felt that the state was in the best position to work with our own construction sites, our own permittees, and our public, be more responsive to the public. We felt it was important to have that local control. So in 1993, EPA turned that program over to the state. One of the requirements that EPA, they provide oversight. They have to make sure that we're issuing our permits appropriately. And so we have to make sure that any state-issued permits comply with both South Dakota's own surface water quality standards, so our state requirements, as well as some federal effluent guidelines that EPA has passed. Those federal guidelines were established to provide a uniform playing field, that you couldn't go to one state and get a better deal pollution-wise than another state. So we've got both federal requirements that we have to comply with, as well as our own state standards. And though I mentioned that because some of the provisions we're going to talk about today are based on one or the other. And then finally, in 2009, EPA actually published some effluent guidelines for construction sites. And as part of this, they had both narrative and numeric limits. EPA actually put some numbers that a construction site had to meet, as well as narrative limits, which is what we've been dealing with all along, just kind of explanations of what you need to do. EPA was sued on this permit, and they ultimately withdrew those numeric limits. So in 2014, they finalized those narrative effluent limits, and since those are statewide minimum federal or nationwide minimum federal requirements, we are required to have that in our permit. I'm going to pause just one moment, please. Yankton was trying to get in touch with me. Here. And no text message, so I'll keep going. Finally, then on January 2015, DENR's permit expired, the current permit that we're operating under. We have administratively extended coverage under this permit. Clark just tried calling me. And I just thought, okay, did you? Okay. If you know what's going on then. Okay, so, pardon. So in January 2015, our permit expired. We've administratively extended coverage, and we're still operating under that, but we need to get that new permit reissued. And so that's why we're here today. So we're in the process of reissuing that permit, and we need to incorporate those new federal requirements into our permit. So, with our construction general permit, the types of discharges that are covered by this permit are the discharge of stormwater from construction sites that are greater than 1 acre. It also includes construction support activities, so if there's staging areas, if there's soil disturbed as part of that, or stockpiles that are off the construction site, that's still covered by this permit. It also covers a larger common plan of development. So this is, say, a developer has a 20-acre site and he's breaking it up into quarter-acre lots. Those individual lots are under that 1 acre size, but that larger common plan of development, it pulls those in because those can certainly be a source of pollution. The department also has the authority to designate a site. So if we see something that maybe is smaller than 1 acre but it's clearly causing problems, we can require somebody to get that permit. We use that very sparingly, but we do have that authority and have occasionally used it. And then one thing that we're going to make a little more clear in this permit, this is a change, construction dewatering will be covered under this permit as long as appropriate controls are in place. So that is one change from the existing permit. Some of the things that are not covered by this permit, post-construction discharges. So if you're building a wastewater treatment facility, the construction of that does need to be covered under this permit, but once that construction is done, that treatment facility is operating, you're going to have a different permit for that. This no longer covers it. This permit also does not address dredge or fill activities, such as from Section 404 permits. You need a separate permit for that. Those activities may be occurring as part of construction, but there's a separate permit from the Corps of Engineers that's required. We're not going to authorize a discharge that's going to threaten water quality. We also cannot authorize a discharge of a regulated substance, such as a spill, or a discharge that would threaten an endangered species. None of these are new. This was all exempted or not covered by the current permit, but I'd like to point that out. Just real briefly how you get coverage. You're required to submit what's called a notice of intent. That's the application that we have for getting coverage under that permit. Before you submit the notice of intent, you have to have a stormwater pollution prevention plan developed. The stormwater pollution prevention plan is the way that you're going to comply with the permit at your particular site. That's supposed to be a living, breathing document. It's going to change as construction goes on, but you do need to have that plan developed before you submit the notice of intent. One of the things that we're proposing to change with this permit is we are going to start accepting NOIs, the notice of intent applications, by email. We're not going to require that hard copy any longer. I think this is a positive change. It's something that we've definitely seen people requesting. We're going to continue to require that hard copy of the application until we get this new permit in place. But at that point, what we're proposing right now is that we will start accepting them that way. So I think that's going to streamline the permitting process for people a little bit. And then something that has been in place since the last permit, but we don't always see these come in, is contractor authorization. We want information on the contractors that are working on the site. They're responsible for complying with the permit. We want to know who's out there doing the work. So we ask that you submit that contractor authorization as well. Okay, so let's get into some information about the permit. One of the things you're going to notice is there's kind of a blue bolded font. These are the things that are highlighting the changes. In a more normal font, these are things that were already existing. So that's going to be kind of your key to look at things that have changed. One of the things that we've always required in the permit is that you do post information that you have a permit. But this is not always readily accessible to people. So in this permit, we're requiring that you post information about the project, including your permit number and a contact name, at a point where it's accessible to the public, where they can see who is responsible for this site and who they can call for more information. This is a change. Our current permit authorizes a couple of non-stormwater discharges. We're tweaking that a little bit to say that firefighting flows are the only thing that's covered under this permit. We've deleted the information about temporary dewatering and BMPs. The temporary dewatering is covered in a separate section. So we just took that out there, and we're going to cover that more broadly. And then the BMPs they're best management practices. We expect people to be using them, so we weren't considering those a discharge anyway, so we felt that was confusing. So we're just saying that this is the only thing that's not covered by the permit, or that is not a stormwater discharge, but is covered by the permit. And finally, a change that's going to be coming that's on the horizon and that we've got kind of a placeholder of the permit for. EPA has promulgated some regulations that require us to go to electronic reporting. This means that those notice of intent, not only would we be accepted by email, but actually online submittals of the permit, as well as any reporting that we require. The deadline for us to have this in place for construction stormwater is December of 2020. So we're going to be working to get our infrastructure in place so we can start accepting that information electronically. We're going to need that time, but that's one of our goals, is to have that in place so we can start accepting it hopefully before then. But as I said, we will start accepting the notices of intent by email to start facilitating that a little more smoothly. Okay, so with that, we're going to kind of jump into the heart of the permit. As I mentioned, one of the things that's required. Did somebody say something?
Yeah, Kelly, this is Brookings checking in. We finally got our mic working.
Oh, excellent. How many people do you have there in Brookings?
It's just me.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ray. Okay. The Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan is kind of the heart of what you put together as a permittee on the site. It's laying out how you're going to comply with the permit. The effluent limits section of the permit basically tells you what you need to do to comply with the permit and what needs to be into your pollution prevention plan. So we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about the effluent limits, what's currently required, as well as any changes. Now, one of the reasons we wanted to talk a little bit about what's required, one of the big changes you may notice if you review the current draft of the permit, we've changed our voice, if you will. I think the current one is kind of in government bureaucracy language. The permittee shall thus and therefore do this. Instead, we're saying you need to do this. We found the language much more clear, much more straightforward. We were communicating better. It's going to look like it's a significant change from the current one. Overall, we're not proposing significant changes, but that language is going to look different. So that's why we wanted to kind of go through what our expectations are under the permit, as well as what we're proposing to change. So with that, the effluent limits section is found in section 3 of the draft general permit. You'll see that it's broken down into 21 subparts. I believe we had 12 previously. That doesn't mean we've got twice as many requirements now. It means we've broken out things a little more clearly in most cases. So it clarifies the limits, and then we do incorporate the additional EPA requirements. I'm going to jump into section 3.2. I'm not going to hit all 21 today because I know I'll put you all to sleep. I'm going to kind of hit the ones that we feel are more critical. For example, section 3.1 says you must properly operate and maintain your controls. That's always been there. That always will be there. We didn't feel like that needed a lot of further attention. So we're going to skip over a few sections that are like that and focus on the meatier ones, if you will. So section 3.2 sets the design event, the precipitation event, First of all, it says you have to design, install, and maintain effective erosion and sediment controls before disturbing the land. So you have to have a plan in place. You have to install them to the extent that you can before you start disturbing soil. The current permit, we had a requirement, a design flow of a 2-inch precipitation event within a 24-hour period. That was actually based, the 2 inches came from the 2-year 24-hour storm event. Across South Dakota, that's roughly 2 inches. So we thought it would be more clear to just say 2 inches. Well, we quickly realized after we issued that permit that what we were really trying to communicate was a frequency and duration. So 2 inches in 15 minutes is very different than 2 inches over a 24-hour period. So we felt like we really needed to go back to that duration type statistical 2-year 24-hour precipitation event. But there is information on the web where you can find out exactly what that is for your site. And I've got a website listed here. I'll just show you a couple of screenshots and the information that you can get. This is what comes up when you hit that website. And you can select the site you're talking about. You can bring up a table that shows, and I don't know if you can see, do you see my mouse here, sort of? You can see down the side, it's pretty small here, but there's different durations, 5 minutes, 24 hours, 60 days. If you look at the 24-hour period and go over across the top, 2-year event, you can see that it's about 2.1. Here's the same information presented graphically. It'd be the yellow line, and again, you can see it's about 2 inches. So the information is out there, but we're going to use that depth, duration, frequency information rather than just a flat number. Section 3.4, perimeter controls. This has been in place probably since the dawn of time with stormwater permits. This is nothing new here. You're required to have effective down gradient controls at a minimum. You have to control the site. What we commonly see are silt fences, hay bales. You need to, at a minimum, have those around the perimeter of the site to control sediment from running off. Here's an example. You can see the silt fence is in place. It looks like it was installed pretty well. However, it's not very effective. It was not put at the end of the perimeter. So while it's stopping everything above the silt fence, you can see that there's sediment running off, and it probably needed to come all the way out to the site. Or an additional control, a secondary control needed to be there. So that's an example of what we're talking about. Section 3.5 discusses sediment basins. We've made a change here. What we have in our current permit, it says that if you're disturbing over 10 acres, you must have a sediment basin. We're removing that from the permit. We heard a lot of feedback that that just didn't really make sense, seemed a little bit arbitrary, so we removed that. We do still have a section that talks about sediment basins, and we're focusing more on the design and operation of the sediment basin. But if you're going to use one as a control, we want to see you drawing water off the top. A sediment basin that draws water off the bottom of the sediment basin is pretty ineffective. So that's the only thing that we have on sediment basins, is that if you're using one, this is the way we want to see you design it and operate it, so it's actually effective. Section 3.9 talks about minimizing run-on, so water running onto your site. This is actually one of the requirements that EPA put into their federal effluent guidelines. It says that you must minimize run-on to your construction site. The idea behind this is simply the less water you have to deal with, the less of a problem you're going to create with water running off the site. So where you can, you're expected to minimize runoff. For example, this little graphic here shows just having a diversion channel to avoid the construction site. And then here's a, I guess, real-world example of where somebody actually put in a holding pond to hold the water to keep it from coming onto the construction site and causing them additional problems to deal with. Another new requirement that came out of EPA's federal guidelines is in section 310, talking about vegetative buffers. We've always had provisions in there that you should try to have a vegetative buffer wherever possible, but we got a lot more specific about it in this new version of the permit, because EPA actually has that in their federal guidelines. What we have written in there right now is that you have to maintain a 50-foot buffer around the site where possible. And if that's not possible, then you have to have some kind of equivalent controls, whether it's 25 feet in a silt fence or something like that. So whenever possible, you need to maintain these vegetative buffers. And there's an exception to that. If you would not have any kind of a discharge of stormwater from the site, you don't have to have that vegetative buffer if you can control the site. But like I said, this is a new requirement that came out of EPA's effluent guidelines. The 50-foot buffer, we put that in to kind of dovetail in with a bill that was passed by the legislature earlier this year, encouraging buffer strips for agricultural activities, and they recommended a 50-foot buffer at a minimum, so that's what we put into the permit. Section 311 talks about preserving native topsoil. With this permit and with EPA's requirements, there's a lot of where possible, or please minimize to the extent that you can. So and this is, a particular example of that. We want you to preserve the native topsoil unless it's not feasible to do that. This is a requirement coming out of EPA's federal effluent guidelines. It's not required if the intended function of the site is to remove the topsoil. But the topsoil, certainly provides a good mechanism to recover the site, better for vegetation, that kind of thing. So that's something that EPA's got in their federal guidelines. Section 312 talks about steep slopes. We are asking that people minimize the disturbance of slopes that are greater than 3-to-1, a 3-to-1 slope. Now, this does not mean you can't construct on these slopes, but we do want people to give some thought to what they can do to minimize the disturbance, not have an entire area ripped up. For example, I like to use this picture as a good example. The lake that you see off to the right is a very high quality lake up in the northeastern part of the state. And this guy went in and pretty much ripped up the whole countryside here, just because he could. So what we saw here is that there was a lot of sediment that ran off. You can see the silt fences that were in place, and I'm going to show you in a later picture that they were not particularly effective. It was not enough for a site like this. And I think this is a site that I've been up here a number of times. It could have been phased in a little bit better. So that's what we're asking is, if it's not necessary to rip up the whole thing at once, don't do it. Phase it. Storm drain inlets. This is probably the number 2 thing that's been in our permit since the dawn of time. We want to protect storm drain inlets that are receiving water. And I'll just show a couple pictures here. When you've got water running off a construction site, especially in an urban type setting, you can get some pretty poor quality water running into the storm sewer, and that provides a direct conduit out to waters of the state. So we're asking that you have some controls in place to minimize the sediment going in there and protecting those inlets from receiving high levels of pollution. Erosive velocity control. When you start managing your site to control the water better, you've got things like culverts, ditches, drains that are going to concentrate the water. The last thing we want to do is encourage people to concentrate that water and cause erosion and sedimentation downstream. So the permit requires that you give some thought to that, and if you're concentrating the flow coming out of a single location, you need to have some controls in place down below that pipe to minimize that erosion. This picture here shows an example of a good one that was put in place, contrasted by this. And with this picture, you can see up near the culvert there was some rock put in place, held down, and it was very effective at controlling the erosion right there. But there was not enough of it. And the way that the flow was concentrated, there was some real deep erosion, deep rills that came off of this site. And while they might have been managing the site great up ahead of this, they dug up a lot of soil and sediment that was later discharged downstream. So that's an example of what we're talking about. This is a new requirement, minimizing soil compaction. This is section 3.15. This is something that, Lorraine, could you take this call? By minimizing soil compaction, what we're asking people to do is to try to keep from pounding down the entire site. You want water infiltrating where you can. If you can get it infiltrating rather than running off, that's going to better manage the pollution leaving the site, better manage the flows leaving the site. However, there's certainly circumstances, whether you're compacting a road bed or building a stabilization pond and you have a liner or other foundations, footings, that kind of thing, where the intent is to compact it. We're recognizing that's an exception to that. But if you can control the access at the site, control equipment rolling across the site, and try to minimize how badly the site becomes compacted, that's what this is expecting, to minimize that. Protecting stockpiles, this is section 3.17. This has been in place for a long time. This is, again, nothing new. We want to see the stockpiles located outside of the natural buffers. We're requiring natural buffers, as I discussed earlier. The last thing we want to do is see you put a large soil stockpile right on that buffer and render it ineffective. You also need to keep it out of stormwater conveyances because it's going to pick up that sediment and deposit it somewhere else. You need to protect the piles from water running on, because that's going to cause erosion and pick up sediment. Minimize dust generation. Now, while we're not talking from the air quality standpoint, when you've got dust flowing off the site, if they're flying off the site, it could land in a waterway, so that creates a pollution issue. And then, should go without saying, but we're going to say it, we do not want to see a soil stockpile placed right in the waters of the state. And here's an example of one that was not placed properly. It's right in the street ditch. If there's storm drains there, it's going to be collecting all of that. It's certainly running off and leaving the site. Stabilization. This is kind of the final key component to what we want to see, that after you've done the work, we want to see the site properly stabilized. And again, this concept is not new in the permit. This has been there all along. What we did not have communicated very clearly is some of the deadlines in when you have to do work. So section 318 lays this out a little more clearly. In the current permit, we say that you have, if something has temporarily ceased construction for at least 14 days, you need to temporarily stabilize it. But it wasn't real clear, do you start at 14 days? When do you have to start that stabilization? So we've got in here now that if you have temporarily stopped construction in an area and it's going to be left alone for at least 14 days, you have to start temporarily stabilizing it the following workday. That doesn't mean have it done, but you need to begin those soil stabilization measures, whether it's placing the hay, the mulch, anything like that. And then the deadline to complete that temporary stabilization is 14 days. So that's, and by complete it, we're talking about if you're seeding it, that the seeding is done, not the grass is growing, that kind of thing. For final stabilization, this is in the current permit. No, there's nothing new here. We require 70% vegetative coverage of the site to be considered permanently stabilized. Now, this is 70% of what was there prior to construction. So if we're talking this was kind of a scrubby, sparse vegetation to begin with, we're not expecting it to look like somebody's Scott's yard lawn. It's 70% of what was there previously. Or if it's more like a shopping mall parking lot that you got the concrete down, that would be final stabilization or non-vegetative stabilization. If it was something that was ag land use to begin with, if you're building a pipeline or building a road through a pasture, that area that was disturbed around it once the construction is completed needs to be returned to that pre-construction ag land use. All of those would be criteria to be finally stabilized, and then you can terminate permit coverage. Got a few more pictures here just to give a few examples of what we're talking about. Here's a project that to me looks like it's pretty clearly done, and they've walked away from the site, and yet they've not stabilized the ditches here. There's a lot of erosion occurring. And contrast that with one that at least has temporary stabilization in place. Here's an area of construction that construction is still clearly going on off in the distance, but they're done with at least part of the area, and it is stabilized. So a portion of it's been stabilized, but not the entire site. And then, of course, something that has reached final stabilization. Section 3.19 talks about maintenance of the controls. It's important that the controls be maintained in effective working order. It's not enough to just put them up and walk away. You have to be checking on them and doing maintenance when they're no longer working effectively. The permit currently requires that you remove sediment if the ponds reach 50% of the capacity or 50% up the way of the silt fence. This is not a change, that's what's in there currently. With the vegetative buffers, you need to repair them if they become filled with sediment or damaged. Cleaning out the inlet protection, if you get that full of sediment, it's going to cause a flooding problem. So you need to keep that cleared out so it's not clogged up and causing different problems. Any other non-functional best management practices have to be repaired, replaced, maintained, or supplemented so that they continue to get good control at the site. Now the deadlines for this we've laid out a little more clearly in the permit. Maintenance on non-effective controls must start within the same working day that's identified. You need to repair and stabilize eroded areas by the end of the workday or implement alternative controls. Now, if for some reason that's not possible, if it's a major blowout, just completely ineffective, you need to document that in your SWIP why you don't get it done that same day. There may be exceptions to that, but you need to, this is our expectation, that you're going to start correcting those as soon as they're identified. If you do need to completely install a new control, you do have up to 7 days or until the next storm event, whichever comes first. And then, as always, anytime you make changes on the site, we want to see that reflected in your stormwater pollution prevention plan, your SWIP. Now this is that site I showed you earlier, the steep slope site. Here's a close-up of what the silt fence looked like there. You can see the lake now off to the left here. This is clearly one that was not properly maintained, and while it was extremely effective to a point, when that maintenance was not done, we saw sediment going over the top of the silt fence and actually into the lake. So an example of why that's important. Pollution prevention procedures. This entire permit really is about pollution prevention. So we've kind of got this catch-all for some other things that are not strictly soil moving type activities. Talking about wastewater from concrete washout, spills on the site, storage of chemicals that you might have. You have to look at these different areas and try to minimize the chance for stormwater to pick up these pollutants. So that's what this section requires. Nothing new in here. This was required all along, but this, I guess we're reiterating that again. And here's an example of a spill at a construction site. You can see with that sheen that it would cause pollution leaving the site. Here's another example. Looks like it's probably a concrete washout here. Cause some staining and washout, possibly reaching a storm sewer. As I mentioned earlier, construction dewatering is now going to be covered by this permit. More clearly, I would say it was all along, but there's been some confusion both within DENR as well as in the regulated community. So we want to state really clearly in the permit that construction dewatering is allowed if you have controls in place, if it's part of your pollution prevention plan. And we also say you have to be out there visually inspecting those dewatering flows. And if you see muddy, dirty water, you have to stop the discharge, and you're going to have to sample until the water's clear or until you can reach that 53 milligrams per liter for the total suspended solids. That sampling and those limits are consistent with a different permit that we had, our temporary discharge permit that we required for construction dewatering. We're rolling those requirements into this. So while it's not a change in our expectations, it is a change into what's in this permit. But it'll allow us to cover those construction dewatering flows with this permit. Okay, that pretty well goes through the effluent limits. We're going to hit a few other things here real quickly. The permit does require site inspections. This has been in the permit all along, nothing new there. Section 4 talks about that. You're required to do an inspection every 7 days. One thing that we are changing is the rainfall event. Within 24 hours of precipitation of 1/4 of an inch. We're proposing to change that. I believe it's 1/2 inch now. Or a snow melt that causes surface erosion. We're requiring people to maintain a rain gauge on site so that they know how much water they received. I'm sure anybody here knows South Dakota. You can be across the street from somebody and get a different rainfall event. So we're going to require people to maintain a rain gauge on site. If you got the site properly stabilized for the winter, then we kind of roll back those inspection requirements to monthly. And you have to resume the weekly inspections by March 1st. This isn't a huge change from our current permit, but we're specifically stating that March 1st date now. I don't believe that's in the current permit. What you have to look at when you're doing site inspections, we want you looking at disturbed areas, looking at the erosion and sediment controls to make sure they're effective, documenting any problems that you see, looking at your vegetative buffers and your stockpiles, look at areas where stormwater typically flows on and off of the site. We want you looking at the entrances and exits at the site and any storage areas. We did put in there specifically that this is a change, but I think it was hopefully understood all along, but we felt like it needed to be clearly stated in the permit. If it's not safe to inspect a site because of the work that's occurring there, if you can't do your weekly inspection there, document that in your inspection report that you couldn't and why, and try to get back out there as soon as you can. But we did want to recognize that there may be unsafe situations there where you can't look at every site every time. Other things you need to look for is any sediment or pollutant discharges, any signs of erosion, scouring at downstream sites, sediment deposits both on and off your site. You want to look and make sure your controls are working correctly as per your stormwater pollution prevention plan. I got too many P's there. Should be 3 P's, not 4. And that's a real critical thing. We can't emphasize that enough, that when you're out there doing the inspections, that SWIP is supposed to be a living, breathing document. It's supposed to change as site conditions change. And those inspections are your way of looking to see if things are working and what you can do better at the site. A lot of times something looks great on paper, doesn't necessarily work on the site. We understand that, make those changes. And then document if you needed to do any corrective action or maintenance, and if that was done. You need to document and record all of your inspections. We actually require a certification statement that what you saw, what you says in your report is what you saw on site. You're certifying that. You need to, as I said, emphasize it one more time, you need to revise it if there's any non-compliance. And you need to make those changes within 7 days. A couple other things that I didn't really focus on the SWIP here. Basically with our SWIP, we want to see you developing that to make sure you meet those effluent limits that we spent time talking about. But I would like to highlight a couple of things that we want to touch on. Under the Clean Water Act, one of the things that the state is required to do is identify water bodies that are impaired, meaning they're not meeting those South Dakota surface water quality standards. When a water body is impaired and not meeting its standards, not meeting its beneficial uses, then we're required to have what's called a total maximum daily load. What that is an analysis of what's causing the pollution, how much pollution is out there, and what needs to be done to bring that pollution level down to where we're meeting our standards. As part of a total maximum daily load, a TMDL, from the government, I love my acronyms. As part of that TMDL, if there are any permitted sources in that area, such as a wastewater treatment facility, such as a construction site, that we need to assign a waste load allocation. How much pollutant loading? If you look at a TMDL as a pie, the waste load allocation is one piece of that pie. Now, with the general permit, with the way we implement these permits, it's hard to just give you a number that this is your piece of the pie, this is your waste load allocation. So what we're saying, what we have said, is that we believe if you're properly following this permit, you're going to meet any waste load allocations that are assigned and ensure the TMDL is met. If we find that that's not true, then we'll have to work with a specific site to have an individual permit and do something different at the site. But what we have found across South Dakota, across the United States, that when people truly make a good effort with their pollution prevention plans, with the best management practices that are out there, we see very little impairment due to construction sites. So we believe this to be true if you comply with the permit. So work with us and help make sure that that's true. And then, so we kind of talked about that. That wasn't really addressed in the previous permit, so we needed to have that discussion that we believe that this permit is going to be effective at protecting South Dakota's waters. And then something else that we put in there into this that we want to see you document in your SWIP. Some of these things, not everything that I talked about is going to be feasible at every single site because of site conditions, because of the nature of what you're constructing. And so if we've kind of put a catch-all in feasibility rationale. If you believe you cannot meet some of these requirements, document why it is in your SWIP. And we'll review that with you when we're on site with an inspection. You know, if we go out there and somebody's SWIP goes, well, this all was completely infeasible, we're probably going to throw the flag on that one. But if, you know, we expect you to make a good faith effort and comply with the permit and document if there's something out there that's not reasonable. And this is actually something that was provided in EPA's federal regulations as well, their new federal regulations. Finally, DENR does try to get out and do inspections at as many sites as we can. So if you've been chosen one of the chosen ones to get an inspection. We thought we'd touch real briefly on what we look at when we go out to do an inspection. We're going to look at your records. Do you have a stormwater pollution prevention plan? That's absolutely key. If you've got a permit, you better be able to show us something that you have a plan. That's the heart and soul of the permit. So that's the number one thing you better have on site that we're going to want to look at. We're also going to want to look at your inspection records and those certification statements that I talked about, that you've done the inspection and you're documenting what you saw out there. We're going to want to walk the site. We're going to be looking at your erosion and sediment controls, the kind of things that you should be looking at in your own inspections every week. We're going to go out and be looking at that as well. We're going to be looking at the entrance and exit sites of the construction site to make sure you're not having to track out, that you've got a stabilized site that's not going to be causing more problems as equipment rolls in and out. We're going to look at the conveyances that you have for taking stormwater off of the site. Are you causing erosion downstream? We will put together an inspection report documenting our findings, discussing any corrective actions, any other follow-up that you need. And typically we're going to require a response. If we saw problems out there, we're going to want to see you respond to what you did to address those. If we saw some real significant issues out there, we'll probably schedule a follow-up inspection and or ask you to submit a copy of your SWIP with the revisions. And just got a few pictures here real quick, just showing you some examples of things that we've seen on sites. The site, was not stabilized, no controls, sediment was being discharged off the site. This was pretty much ignoring the requirements of the permit. Here's an example where there were some controls in place, but they weren't installed real correctly and not really maintained properly, rendering them somewhat ineffective. Here's a site that we saw where there are a bunch of barrels. You can see that there's been some spills, some leakage out there. Can't imagine they know what's in those barrels unless they have a color-coded list somewhere. They're not labeled, and certainly problematic with that site. Already kind of showed you this site here. Here's an example of kind of an urban setting where it was a very small construction project, but they didn't have a stabilized access point, and as a result, sediment's getting drug off the site. We've got a bunch of mud out in the street, and even just this very small site was causing a fair amount of pollution coming off the site. Another example of something that did not have the access site stabilized. Didn't really talk about it, but the permit says that when you're establishing a vegetative cover, we expect an appropriate vegetative cover. Invasive species would not fit that requirement. That's kind of what we found on this site. They didn't have any inlet protection. Sediment was being tracked out of the site. Here's another example of control that's not maintained. You can't really see it, but there was a silt fence there. It's laying down. There's some erosion rills, and sediment was discharged off the site. So that's the permit. That's a little bit on what we expect when we go out and do inspections. So I want to talk real briefly on kind of our next steps with this permit. We have the permit out right now for informal comment. When we issue a permit, we have to invite public comment, and for at least 30 days, we have to specifically respond to every comment, and if we make changes, we have to republic notice it. So with a permit that affects this many people, that is statewide, what we wanted to do is put it out for informal comment first, where our process is a little bit easier to have a dialogue on what the permit requires and what doesn't make sense, what isn't working for people. So we've got this informal comment period open right now. We'd like to have any comments by the end of the month, by October 31st, on things that you don't like, things that you think we need to do differently. We'll take that all into account, make changes, and put it out for formal 30-day public comment in all the daily newspapers in South Dakota. We're hoping to do that before the end of the year. And it'll really depend on just how extensive the comments, the feedback that we get on the permit. Like I said, we've already started getting some comments, and we're going to start reviewing that. We've gotten some good feedback. We've found that this has been a really effective way to head off concerns, to hopefully make a permit that makes sense. Something that sounds great while I'm sitting in my ivory tower in Pierre doesn't always make sense when you get out in the field, and we need that feedback to have a permit that works for you. So that's the process going forward. Once we complete that 30-day comment period, then we'll be issuing the permit, and we'll notify anybody that's currently covered that they're now covered under the new permit. As part of that, I think maybe I have a slide later on, but it seems like a good place to say it. For any existing sites that are already covered under the permit, there may be some changes that you need to make with this new permit. We're going to give people time to update their SWIP. A date will ultimately be in there when we public notice it. We don't really have a date set yet because we don't know when we'll public notice it. My goal is to give people about 6 months to update their SWIP. but also try to account for construction period, not having it have changes in the middle of a construction period. So accounting for those two things, giving you time and having something that makes sense once construction's already underway. The last thing that I want to talk about is DENR funding. Since we got delegation of this permit, actually, if you want to go ahead and, I'm going to leave it on the slides here. Since South Dakota was delegated in 1993, we've been charging fees for some of the permits that we have. And that fee funding covered the majority of the funding that we needed for even for the stormwater program 25 years ago when we first took over the program. As time has gone on, we haven't changed those fees in 25 years, and we have had to supplement that funding. EPA has provided us a grant. As part of the Clean Water Act, as part of most of the federal environmental acts, it does provide a provision for EPA to provide some funding for these programs. States actually implement 96% of the federal environmental programs. We're doing the majority of the work. Certainly here in South Dakota, we're doing the majority of that federal programs right here at the state level. As I said right when we started out today, that we felt that this was important, that we have that delegation, that authority to do the program, and we wanted to keep local control to the extent that we could. So we put those fees in place, we took over the program, and then the federal grant that we get, like I said, fees haven't changed in 25 years. Our federal grant has actually started to kind of level off as well. This chart actually represents all the federal grants that DENR receives, but it certainly shows the trend that we've been dealing with the grant my program works with. Things peaked in about 2012. They dropped off sharply the next year, and we really haven't recovered. At best, our grant money from EPA has stayed pretty level. So with our fees not changing, we don't charge fees for stormwater permits. With our grant funding seeming to go down, we've found ourselves over the last couple of years with our money has been pretty tight within my program. Over the last year, I've had between 3 and 4 vacancies in my program because I've not had the funding to replace those positions. What we've been looking at is how do we deal with that? We've been trying to cut our own costs, not filling positions. We've pursued one-time grant money from EPA where we could, but that's not allowed us to kind of keep our head afloat. Now we're also hearing that President Trump is proposing up to a 40% cut in this grant that we rely on, which is going to be kind of the death knell for us to continue. So kind of the two basic options that we've looked at is no longer doing the program here in South Dakota, turning it back over to EPA. That is definitely not my preferred option. So I'm standing here today to talk to you about the other option that we're looking at, and that is changing our fee structure. We're looking at changes to several of our fees, but what I want to talk with you about today specifically is implementing fees for the construction permits that we issue. We are putting together a bill that would authorize us to charge fees on construction projects. What we're proposing is to base that on the size of the project. For smaller projects, less than 5 acres, we're proposing an annual fee of $100 per year. And that would be while the project is in construction. Once the site is complete and stabilization is done, that fee would stop. But that fee would be in place while construction is going on until stabilization. For larger projects between 5 and 50 acres, we're proposing a fee of $250 per year. And for sites greater than 50 acres, we're proposing a fee of $750 per year. In addition, I did want to throw this one out. We are looking at industrial stormwater fees also. Where I could see this, any of you caring would be a sand and gravel operation would be subject to these fees, and we're looking at an annual fee of $100 per year for those. With these fees, along with some of the other changes that we're looking at, if we're able to implement those fees, we would be able to fully fund the program and keep it here in South Dakota. One of the first things that people ask me is, okay, I'm getting it for free now, what am I going to get if you make this change to charge us fees? As I said, we're required to get things online, and we have been working on that actually for several years, working with our computer people, our Bureau of Information and Technology. They have been working unfortunately at a very slow rate because I do not have much money I can have them put towards this project. So while they are working away on it, and I hope we'll have it in place by 2020, if we had funding to put towards this, we could get it in place much more quickly. And I think that's going to be a benefit to the people that deal with these permits, to have that online permit application, online reporting available. We also receive requests for technical assistance and training on what's required under the stormwater permit. The Department of Transportation is doing a great job out there. They require training of anybody that's doing one of their projects. And we have gotten to the point with my staffing levels, and I'm having trouble even providing a staff person to talk about our permit in this training. So at a minimum, DNR needs to be able to put more resources towards DOT's efforts. And what I would like to see is that we expand that training and make it available beyond just DOT, whether it's partnering with DOT or putting together something similar and putting it out there for everybody. So we need to do more in that area, and that's what we hope to be able to do with having the resources from these revised fees. And finally, and I hope this is the #1 benefit to these proposed fees, is that we would keep the program in South Dakota rather than being subject to the requirements of EPA in either Denver or Washington, D.C. So that's why we've been looking at all of this. The next steps forward for this, I guess step 1 would be to bring it to the legislature. We're hoping to be able to do that in 2018, in this coming legislative session. If the legislature did approve these new fees, they would go into effect July 1st of 2018. Existing construction stormwater permittees would receive a fee statement in July of 2018, and that fee would be due in August 31st of 2018. And then any new permits coming forward would submit their fee with that notice of intent, that new application that they're coming in, and it would be due annually from that point forward. Whew, so with that, I'm going to stop talking for a few minutes and open it up to questions. I'm going to go ahead and start with Pierre, since that's pretty much where everybody's at. Anybody here in Pierre have questions?
I have one.
Lori.
At the very beginning, you said that one of the new proposed changes is that we would have to post project contact information in a viewable area after the project was done, with project permit information and contact information. How long would we have to keep that up?
It would not be when it's done. It would be while the project's going.
Just while it's going.
When the project's done, that would go
Then
away
it
with
would come
everything
down?
else. Yes.
All right.
Yes, that would just be while the project's
Because it
going.
said post-project.
I tried to find a way to reword that. You need to post project information.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
It's
put
not
it up.
after. it's-
Put it up.
All right.
Yes.
I get
Thank
it.
you for that
Thank
clarification. Any other questions?
You hit briefly on the contractor authorization letter that's required. DOT currently submits that after our pre-construction meeting, and that's after we've applied with the NOI to get the permit.
Correct.
Is that process still going to be the same?
Yep, that's acceptable. A lot of times when people are first putting in their notice of intent, they don't even know who the contractor is going to be, and that's certainly the case with DOT. Once you know who the contractor is, we want to see that come in. So what you've been doing is fine. Sometimes people know it right up front. It can come in with the NOI, or it can come in once you know.
Okay.
And if it changes for whatever reason, or there's an additional contractor that's coming in later for landscaping work or something like that, you could put that information in a year or two later when they come on board.
Okay, and then we only put in the information for the prime contractor on that. Are you suggesting that we're going to have to fill in additional information when it comes to our subcontractors on site?
What has always been in the permit actually is anybody that's responsible for erosion and sediment at the site. So, if you're talking about your subcontractor for lighting inside the building, well, you would be, but that would not be the case. But if it's, like I said, a landscape person who's coming in to do that final stabilization work, that would be a subcontractor that we would need to know about. And it's been there. We're highlighting it because we know we're not getting all that information now.
Okay.
So we do want to start seeing that. Any other questions here in Pierre? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
The reduction from a half-inch to a quarter inch, did you go into the basis of the reason why it dropped there?
I did not. Where that came from is EPA had two different sets of requirements for something that was drought-stricken versus not. Since South Dakota kind of bounces in and out of drought-stricken all the time, we thought that might be a little bit of a moving target, so we just went with that lower number altogether. That's something, we're certainly willing to discuss. That's open for comment, as is the whole permit. But that was our rationale for doing that, rather than having those two different standards out there.
Okay.
Go
I
ahead.
do have one more.
Yep.
Total maximum daily load.
Yes.
I assume that if we're working in the White River, building a bridge, it's going to be a lot different than if we're working in Rapid Creek as far as what's allowable.
Correct.
Because the White River has a natural background of a lot of.
Called the White
suspended
River
falls.
for a reason.
You can walk on it.
Yes.
And so I assume there's going to be some kind of chart or table or letter or something to indicate to us what is allowable background.
That would be our water quality standards.
Okay.
And actually, the White River is a great example. We used to have a standard of, I think, 90 milligrams per liter on the White River, which we were never going to meet. We knew that. So we actually went in and made site-specific standards for the White River that are in the thousands to reflect. And actually, with that example, there were critters out there, fish out there that actually relied on that cloudy water to hunt fish. We would actually hurt them if we cleaned up the water too much. So yeah, we do have different standards. That's the reason we have different standards. And that, if anybody has questions, we've got that information posted, but we can certainly kind of help you navigate that information.
Okay.
I will come back to Pierce. If you have any other questions, keep thinking about it. I'm going to go around to the sites, see if anybody has anything. And if we have anybody, it's the site. So I'm going to go one time through all the sites. Al, is there anybody there in Aberdeen?
Nope, just me.
Okay, I will not come back to you. If something changes, let me know, okay?
Okay.
Belle Fourche, is there anybody there? I'm going to take that as a no. Ray, you said there was nobody there in Brookings. Has that changed? Custer?
We have a couple people that attended.
Is this Custer?
Yes,
Great. Did you have any questions there?
we do not.
Okay. Let me know if that changes, all right? Did we ever get Huron online? Lucy, anybody in Mitchell?
No people, no questions.
All right. Randy, any questions in Rapid?
Are you going to allow copies of your PowerPoint?
Oh,
we get
yeah.
those?
I would be happy to share copies of the PowerPoint. If you want to just leave if you want a copy of that, make sure you include your email address and maybe make a note on the sign-in sheet. And that reminds me of something I meant to say right at the beginning. We are actually taping this. So when we're going to put it online, hopefully by the end of the week, we'll have that copy available. And we'll have it on our website that folks can actually hear the vocal along with the presentation. Any other questions out there?
I think we're good.
All right. Thank you. Jill, anybody in Sioux Falls have questions?
No, we have 0 questions at this time.
All right. Let me know if that changes. Pat in Spearfish.
Yes, we have a couple questions.
Great.
Hi, Kelly. It's Robert with the City of Spearfish.
Hello. How are you?
Fine. Who's going to be providing the outreach and training to the contractors for this new stuff?
Well, at the moment, I have 4 positions dedicated to stormwater. I have only 2 of them filled. So right now, it's tough to provide. This is it for the moment. If we're able to get those fees in place and get these positions filled, I guess I'm looking at a couple of different options. We haven't really fleshed it out yet. One option would certainly be for DENR staff to provide that training. We certainly will continue to partner with DOT on the work that they're already doing. I'm also kind of toying with the idea of whether we tack on to the contractor that DOT already has and ask them to expand that training, or do a contract with somebody else to do some training. So I haven't really worked that out, but one way or the other, we do intend to provide more of that.
And then, are you guys going to continue to be responsible for the compliance inspections, or is it going to be like now where we kind of do it for you and call if there's a real bad problem.
And are you speaking on behalf of the city? Do you mean?
Yeah. Well,
Um,
you know, and we've been taking care of some of the bigger stuff here because you haven't had anybody around. So, and it works okay. We're just wondering if we're going to continue the cooperative stuff like that, or.
That's a great question, and I'm going to kind of give you two different answers. For Spearfish and other communities like Spearfish that are required to have their own municipal stormwater program, we are going to look for the city to be the front line and then reporting to us if there's bigger problems. Once we have staff to better respond to those, I think you're going to find us to be more responsive to those concerns, and probably be a better partner than we are right now. But we are still going to be looking for the city to be that front line. For other communities that have not been required to have their own stormwater program, DENR is going to be totally in the driver's seat on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
Nope.
Okay, great, thank you. Watertown. Anybody there?
No questions.
Okay, thanks, Keith. Did Yankton ever get online or what?
There was 2 folks that showed up, but since there was the flood and the stuff not working, Clark took their names. They're going to watch, and they're hoping for the presentation later.
Great. Okay, yep, I will follow up with them. Okay, any other questions here in Pierre? Any other questions anywhere out there? All right, well, thank you very much. I've actually put the presentation back up with you, Lorraine. I'm putting up our contact information here. Jill Riedel is our main stormwater person in our Sioux Falls office, and I've got her contact information there. Katie Luce is our new program assistant in stormwater. She's handling processing all the NOIs out of the Pierre office, and is our 1-800 number person. If you call for stormwater, you're going to get Katie. And I am helping out where I can with stormwater until we get our positions filled. And then we've got our stormwater information available online at the website there. Hopefully you can read that okay. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate questions and people coming in, and appreciate your attention. Thank you very much. We'll close it out.